Some places do not look forgotten because they are empty. They look forgotten because they are still waiting for the right heart to arrive. Caleb Whitaker learned that on a cold morning above Ridge Hollow, when his German shepherd vanished halfway into a black split in the mountain and the wind seemed to hold its breath. 1 second, Ranger had been beside him, his thick coat stirred by the high country breeze, his ears standing sharp against the pale Wyoming sky. The next, the dog had pushed through a curtain of dry brush and disappeared into a narrow crack in the stone, leaving only the sound of his claws scraping somewhere inside the ridge. Caleb called his name once, then again, his voice rough from a night spent sleeping in the cab of his old Ford pickup. No bark came back. Only 3 steady scratches echoed from within the dark, slow and deliberate, as if Ranger had found a door the mountain did not want opened. Caleb stepped closer, boots crunching over shale and frost-burned grass. He was 40 years old, though some mornings his bones felt older, a homeless veteran with no address except the road, no family left except the dog that had walked beside him through every quiet season after the army. His worn olive jacket hung heavy on his shoulders, faded at the cuffs and patched near one elbow. Beneath it, a gray shirt clung to him in the chill. His dark jeans were marked with dust from the ridge trail, and his rugged boots carried the scars of truck stops, back roads, and too many nights spent looking for work that did not last. Caleb was white, broad-shouldered, and still built with the careful strength of a man who had once carried equipment through hard places, but his face had become quieter over the years. There were lines near his eyes from sun, worry, and long silences. His short brown hair had begun to show threads of gray at the temples, and his jaw held the shadow of stubble he never cared enough to shave clean anymore. He lifted his flashlight and aimed it into the opening. At first, the beam found only stone, dust, and the pale roots of brush gripping the rock like old fingers. Then the light traveled deeper, and Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. This was not a natural hollow. Beyond the broken edge of the ridge, the darkness narrowed into a passage, rough but straight, cut by human hands long ago and hidden so well that 1,000 people could have walked past without noticing. Ranger shifted inside, his amber eyes flashing back in the beam. The dog did not look frightened. He looked certain. Caleb crouched, pressing one palm to the stone, and felt a faint vibration under his skin, soft as a distant engine or a heartbeat carried through the earth. He had known that feeling once in the service, back when he worked around old structures, tunnels, and ground that told stories before men did. Stone had a language. So did silence. But this silence felt different. It was not empty. It was listening. Just above the crack, half buried under lichen and dust, Caleb noticed marks cut into the rock. He rubbed them with his thumb until the old grit fell away. The letters came slowly into the light, uneven but unmistakable. 35 feet in, do not stop. The words sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. He looked behind him across Briggs Ridge, the inheritance nobody wanted. A long spine of gray stone and scrub grass stretched under the sky, too steep for farming, too dry for grazing, too stubborn for developers. Folks in town had laughed when the lawyer told him Eleanor Briggs had left it to him. They said the old woman must have been confused. They said Caleb had inherited a pile of cracked rock and rattlesnake wind. Some had told him to sell it for whatever a mining company would pay and move on before taxes swallowed him whole. Caleb had almost believed them. He had stood in the diner 2 nights earlier with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands while men in ball caps joked that he was now the richest man in worthless land. He had not answered. He had learned long ago that not every insult needed a reply. Ranger had simply sat at his feet, watching the room with the patient judgment only a good dog could carry. But Eleanor had not been confused. Caleb knew that now. He remembered the last thing she had written in the envelope the lawyer gave him, the paper thin and trembling with age. Ranger will know where to begin. At the time, he had thought it was kindness, the gentle poetry of a lonely widow who liked dogs more than people. Now, standing before a hidden passage cut into the ridge, he wondered how long she had carried this secret, and why she had trusted it to a man who owned nothing but a truck, a worn jacket, and a faithful German shepherd, Ranger backed out just enough to look at him, dust powdering his muzzle. Then the dog gave 3 short barks, not loud, not wild, but exact, the same signal he used when something mattered. Caleb swallowed, tightened his grip on the flashlight, and leaned toward the dark. The wind moved across Ridge Hollow behind him, bending the dry grass in silver waves. Far below, the town sat small and unaware, its rooftops catching the first weak light of morning. Caleb had come expecting disappointment, maybe closure, maybe one more strange little mercy from a woman who had seen through his silence. Instead, the ridge had opened its mouth. He touched the carved words once more, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips. 35 feet in. Do not stop. Caleb looked at Ranger and gave the smallest nod. He had not come searching for a miracle. But sometimes, the earth keeps one hidden until the right soul is ready to listen. Caleb did not enter the ridge that morning. Not yet. Something in him, some old discipline that had survived every lost job and every night spent under a windshield fogged with breath, told him that a hidden passage did not deserve a reckless man. He eased Ranger back from the crack, rested one hand on the dog's dusty neck, and listened a few seconds longer to the faint pulse inside the stone. It came and went beneath his palm like water moving far below, steady enough to be real, soft enough to make him question it. Then he stepped away, marking the spot with a strip of red cloth torn from an old shop rag in his truck. Ranger watched him with those clear amber eyes, disappointed but obedient, as if the dog understood that mysteries were sometimes safest when approached with patience. The sun had risen higher over Briggs Ridge by then, laying thin gold across the shale and dry grass. From up there, Ridge Hollow looked almost gentle, a small Wyoming town tucked between folded hills, with a church steeple, 2 grain silos, a feed store, and the silver thread of a creek that had been shrinking every summer for as long as anyone could remember. Caleb stood on the ridge trail and felt the strange weight of ownership settle around him. Yesterday, this land had been a joke told over coffee. Today, it felt like a locked room handed to him by a woman who had known exactly where the key was hidden. On the drive back into town, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat of the old Ford, his nose pointed toward the ridge as long as he could see it through the dusty rear window. Caleb kept glancing at the folded map Eleanor had left him, now resting on the dashboard beneath the cracked glass. The paper was brittle, yellowed at the edges, and marked with lines that did not match any modern road. Near the northern face of the ridge, Eleanor had drawn a small red dot in careful ink. Beside it were 3 words, "Where he listened." Caleb had no idea who he meant, though he suspected it was her husband, Thomas Briggs, the man people in town spoke of only in fragments. Surveyor. Tunneler. Dreamer. Gone too early. Depending on who told the story, Thomas had either left town, lost his mind chasing water under stone, or simply walked into the hills one day and never truly came back the same. Caleb had learned that small towns kept records in 2 places: courthouse basements and old men's memories. The courthouse came first. It was a square brick building with a flag snapping softly above the steps and a lobby that smelled like floor wax, paper, and winter coats. Ranger waited outside in the shade, lying down with his head on his paws, while Caleb stood at the county clerk's counter holding Eleanor's map in both hands. The clerk, a woman named Marcy Bell with silver glasses and a tired kindness in her eyes, studied the paper longer than he expected. Her face changed when she saw the red dot. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. "Mrs. Briggs gave you this?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "She left me the ridge." Marcy looked past him toward the window, where Ranger's ears twitched at passing footsteps. "Most folks thought she would leave it to the county. Not that the county wanted it." Caleb folded the edge of the map carefully. "Do you know what is under it?" Marcy hesitated. Behind her, the old file drawers lined the wall like sleeping witnesses. "I know there were surveys done after the dry years. Late 1940s, maybe early 1950s. Thomas Briggs filed some papers, but a lot of them went missing before I started here. My father used to say Thomas believed the ridge had a heart full of water." She gave a sad little smile. People laughed at him for that. Caleb looked down at the map again. A heart full of water. The phrase stayed with him. Marcy disappeared into the back room and returned with a thin folder tied in cotton string. Inside were copies of old land notices, faded sketches, and one black and white photograph. Caleb paused over the picture. It showed a younger Eleanor standing beside a tall man in a work shirt and suspenders at the base of Briggs Ridge. They were smiling, not proudly, but privately, like two people standing in front of a promise only they understood. At their feet sat a German shepherd, darker than Ranger but with the same upright ears and watchful posture. On the back of the photograph, written in blue ink, were the words, Thomas, Eleanor, and Major, North Face, before the ceiling. Caleb felt Ranger's absence suddenly, as if the dog outside had become part of a story that began long before either of them arrived. Ceiling? He asked. Marcy lowered her voice, though no one else stood nearby. That is what my father called it. He said Thomas closed something up in the ridge after strangers started asking questions. Men from out of state. Company men, he called them. They came wearing polished boots and smiles too clean for ranch country. Caleb understood that kind of smile. He had seen it on men who wanted land but not the people attached to it. He thanked Marcy, tucked the copies inside his jacket, and stepped back into the cool afternoon. Ranger rose before Caleb said a word, tail still, eyes fixed on the folder. The dog sniffed at once, then gave a low breath through his nose, almost like recognition. Caleb stood on the courthouse steps and looked toward the dark line of Briggs Ridge beyond town. The carved warning returned to him, clear as if the stone itself had spoken it again. 35 feet in. Do not stop. For the first time since Eleanor's will had placed that unwanted land in his hands, Caleb understood that she had not given him a place. She had given him a question. And somewhere behind that sealed stone, the answer was still waiting. By late afternoon, the sky over Ridge Hollow had turned the color of old pewter, and a slow wind moved through town with the dry whisper of grass against fence wire. Caleb sat in the front seat of his Ford outside the courthouse, the thin folder from Marcy Bell resting on his lap, Eleanor's brittle map unfolded across the steering wheel. Ranger sat beside him without making a sound, but his nose never left the folder for long. Every few breaths, the German shepherd leaned closer, as if the paper carried a scent older than dust. Caleb studied the black and white photograph again. Thomas Briggs. Eleanor. The first German shepherd, Major. North Face, before the ceiling. The words seemed simple, yet they made the air inside the truck feel smaller. Before the ceiling meant there had been a time when the ridge was open. A time before warnings were carved into stone. A time before people laughed at Thomas Briggs for hearing water where everyone else heard only wind. Caleb ran his thumb along the photograph's edge, careful not to bend it. Thomas stood straight in the picture, one hand resting on the dog's head, the other holding a rolled survey plan. Eleanor looked younger than Caleb could imagine, her hair pinned back, her face bright with the kind of hope that had not yet learned to hide. Behind them, Briggs Ridge rose in a pale wall of stone, and near the bottom of that wall was a dark slit barely visible unless a person knew where to look. Caleb knew where to look now. He looked up as a pickup rolled past slowly, the driver glancing toward him with the curious half-smile of someone who had already heard too much and understood too little. By supper time, the town knew Caleb had gone asking about the ridge. In a place like Ridge Hollow, questions traveled faster than weather. He put the folder inside his jacket, started the engine, and drove toward the small diner at the edge of Main Street, where the sign buzzed in red neon and the windows glowed with the warm yellow light of coffee, pie, and ordinary talk. He had not eaten since morning, and Ranger needed water. Inside, the air smelled of fried potatoes, cinnamon, and rain that had not yet fallen. Conversation softened when Caleb entered, not stopping completely, but bending around him the way creek water bends around a stone. Ranger stayed close to his leg, calm and steady, wearing his worn leather harness. Caleb chose a booth near the back. A waitress named June brought him coffee before he asked, then set a metal bowl of water on the floor for Ranger. "He is prettier than most of the customers," she said, smiling at the dog. Caleb almost smiled back. He knows it. For a few minutes the world felt simple. Coffee warmed his hands. Ranger drank quietly. Rain began tapping the front window in small, careful notes. Then a man at the counter spoke loud enough for the room to hear. "You thinking of digging into that ridge, Whitaker?" Caleb did not turn right away. He recognized the voice. Dale Mercer, hardware store owner, local gossip collector, and the kind of man who measured other people's choices by how useful they were to him. "I am thinking of looking at what was left to me," Caleb said. Dale gave a short laugh. "That ridge was left alone for a reason. Thomas Briggs wasted half his life chasing fairy tales under that rock. Eleanor kept the story alive because grief does that to people." The word grief made Caleb look up. Not because it angered him, but because it sounded too easy in Dale's mouth. Across the diner, an older rancher lowered his fork and stared into his plate. June stopped wiping the counter. There were memories in the room now, rising like dust in a shaft of light. Caleb took a slow drink of coffee. "Did you know Thomas?" he asked. Dale shrugged. "Everybody knew of him. That is not the same thing." The diner quieted a little more. Dale turned on his stool. "Listen, I am giving you good advice. There is a company still interested in buying mineral rights out there. You could get enough to fix that truck, maybe rent a place for a while. Take the money before you find out Eleanor gave you a burden dressed up like a blessing." Ranger lifted his head. Not aggressively. Not loudly. He simply looked at Dale with such still attention that the man shifted in his seat. Caleb rested one hand on the dog's shoulder. Beneath the thick fur, Ranger's body was tense, not from threat, but from recognition. That same focused stillness he had shown at the crack in the stone. Caleb set a few bills on the table and stood. June walked over before he could leave and slipped something beside his coffee cup, a folded napkin with an address written in blue pen. "My father worked road survey in the 70s, she said softly. He kept old county copies in his garage. He always said the Briggs papers disappeared from town hall, but not from everywhere." Her eyes flicked toward Dale, then back to Caleb. "Go after dark. He does not like visitors, but he likes dogs." Caleb thanked her with a nod that carried more than words. Outside, the rain had become a silver curtain over Main Street. Ranger jumped into the truck, then looked toward the ridge through the wet windshield. Caleb unfolded the napkin. The address led to a gravel road south of town, past the old water tower and the abandoned schoolhouse. He did not know what waited there, only that Eleanor's question was growing wider with every person who tried to make him turn away. As he pulled from the curb, the neon diner sign flickered behind him, and in the mirror Caleb saw Dale Mercer step to the window, watching. The look on the man's face was no longer amused. It was worried. Caleb drove into the rain with Ranger beside him and the folder warm beneath his jacket, feeling for the first time that the secret under Briggs Ridge was not merely hidden. It was being guarded, not by stone alone, but by years of silence, old promises, and the quiet courage of people who had waited for someone stubborn enough to listen. The gravel road south of town narrowed until the world seemed to fold itself into rain, pine shadow, and the dull glow of Caleb's headlights. Water ran in thin silver lines down the windshield, blurring the old water tower into a ghostly shape behind him and turning the abandoned schoolhouse into a dark rectangle against the hillside. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, body still except for the quiet movement of his nose. The address on June's napkin led Caleb past the last mailbox, over a cattle guard, and toward a low farmhouse tucked beneath cottonwoods that bent with the weather. A single porch light burned beside the door. It was not bright, but after the long road and the town's uneasy silence, it looked almost like a promise. Caleb parked near a rusted windmill and let the engine die. For a moment he listened. Rain tapped on the roof of the Ford. Somewhere beyond the trees, runoff whispered through a ditch. Ranger gave one soft breath and looked toward the house. "All right," Caleb murmured, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to the dog, the night, or the part of himself that still expected doors to close before they opened. He stepped out, pulling his worn olive jacket tighter around his gray shirt, his rugged boots sinking slightly into wet gravel. Ranger came down beside him and shook rain from his coat before moving toward the porch with careful confidence. Caleb had learned to trust that walk. When Ranger moved that way, he had already decided the place was worth approaching. Before Caleb knocked, the door opened a few inches. An old man stood in the warm slit of light, thin as a fence rail, wearing a brown cardigan over a plaid shirt, his white hair combed back in stubborn little waves. His eyes were sharp, pale green, and not surprised at all. "You must be the veteran with Eleanor's Ridge," he said. Caleb kept his hands visible, respectful. "Caleb Whitaker. June said you might have known something about the old surveys." The man looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd looked back, calm and patient. Something softened in the old man's face. A dog that can wait at a threshold is usually better company than a man who barges through one. "Come in." His name was Arthur Bell, June's father, 87 years old, retired from County Road Survey, though the word retired seemed too small for a man whose living room was filled with road maps, brass measuring tools, field notebooks, and framed photographs of ridgelines under wide western skies. The house smelled of cedar, pipe tobacco that had long gone cold, and paper aging in dry cabinets. Caleb wiped his boots carefully and stood near the doorway until Arthur waved him to the table. Ranger settled by Caleb's chair, but his eyes moved immediately to a tall metal cabinet in the corner. Arthur noticed. "He smells the past," the old man said. "Paper holds more than ink, if you asked me." Caleb removed the courthouse folder from inside his jacket and laid it on the table. Arthur put on a pair of glasses and looked through the pages slowly. He did not speak for a long while. Rain filled the silence. The old clock on the wall clicked like a patient witness. Finally, Arthur touched the photograph of Thomas, Eleanor, and Major with one crooked finger. "That was a fine dog," he said. "Major found springs no instrument could find. Thomas used to say the Lord gave dogs humility so men would not be too ashamed when they proved wiser than us." Caleb glanced down at Ranger, whose ears twitched at the sound of the name. "You knew Thomas Briggs?" Arthur nodded. "I was young, but yes. He hired me one summer to carry stakes and hold a survey rod. He believed Ridge Hollow was drying up on top while sitting over enough water below to keep farms alive for generations. Folks thought he was chasing a dream because dreams make easy targets in a hard town." Arthur stood with effort and walked to the metal cabinet. He unlocked it with a key from his shirt pocket and pulled out a flat archival box wrapped in twine. The way he handled it made Caleb sit a little straighter. This was not a souvenir. This was something preserved because someone had feared it might be needed. Arthur set the box on the table and opened it. Inside lay maps far more detailed than the courthouse copies, hand-drawn cross-sections of Briggs Ridge, marked depths, old test points, and a blue pencil line labeled Main Aquifer Channel. Caleb felt the room grow quiet around him. Even Ranger rose and placed his front paws lightly beside Caleb's knee, peering at the paper as if the blue line carried a scent. Arthur turned one map and tapped a point near the north face. "There was an access passage here, 35 feet from the outer split to the first survey door. Beyond that was a chamber where Thomas kept the instruments. He sealed it after the company men came." Caleb leaned closer. "What company?" Arthur's mouth tightened, not with anger, but with the sorrow of remembering people who chose profit over neighbors. "Redvale Holdings. They arrived in polished cars and asked too many questions about dry wells, tax liens, and who might be desperate enough to sell. Thomas believed they wanted to control the water before the town understood it existed. Eleanor believed it too. She kept every scrap after he passed." He lifted a smaller envelope from the box, its paper brown with age. On the front, in careful handwriting, was Caleb's name. Caleb stared at it, unable to speak. Arthur slid it across the table. "Eleanor gave me this 11 years ago. Said if a man came with a German shepherd and the ridge in his name, I was to hand it over. I told her that sounded like a storybook. She said some truths wait so long they begin to look like stories. Caleb opened the envelope with care. Inside was a single note and a small brass tag stamped with the name Major. The note read, "Caleb, if you are reading this, Ranger has found what Major once found. Do not let them convince you stone is worthless when it is protecting life. 35 feet in is only the beginning. Trust the dog, then trust the water." Caleb sat very still. The rain softened outside. Ranger lowered his head onto Caleb's knee, and for a moment the old farmhouse, the maps, the ridge, and Eleanor's quiet faith seemed tied together by one thin golden thread. Arthur closed the box but left the largest map open. "You will need tools, lights, rope, and someone who knows how old tunnels breathe," he said. Caleb looked at the blue line running beneath Briggs Ridge like a hidden river. "Do you know someone?" Arthur gave a faint smile. "I am old, not useless." Outside, the porch light glowed against the rain, and far beyond the dark fields the ridge waited in silence, holding its secret a little longer. By the time dawn reached Arthur Bell's farmhouse, the rain had thinned into a silver mist, and Briggs Ridge stood beyond the fields like a long gray animal sleeping under the clouds. Caleb had spent the night at Arthur's kitchen table, not sleeping much, only reading maps until the lines began to live behind his eyes. Main aquifer channel. North face access. First survey door. Sealed chamber. Each phrase felt less like information and more like a hand placed gently on his shoulder, guiding him towards something Eleanor had protected longer than most people protected their own memories. Arthur moved slowly but with purpose, packing equipment into 2 canvas bags, battery lanterns, chalk, a coil of climbing rope, a hand level, dust masks, work gloves, a small pry bar, and 3 old survey flags wrapped in faded orange cloth. Caleb tried to carry both bags, but Arthur gave him a look over his glasses that ended the argument before it began. "A man should accept help before pride turns simple work into hard work," he said. Caleb nodded, because there was nothing in that sentence he could disagree with. Ranger waited by the porch steps, his coat damp from the mist, his amber eyes fixed toward the northern hills. He had eaten the food June left in a covered bowl, accepted one gentle scratch behind the ear from Arthur, and then returned to watching the ridge as if he had been appointed its keeper. They left in Caleb's Ford just after sunrise, the old truck rattling down the gravel road with Arthur in the passenger seat and Ranger in the back seat beside the gear. The town was barely awake when they passed through Main Street. The diner lights were on, the church bell gave one soft note in the cool air, and a delivery truck idled outside the feed store. Caleb noticed Dale Mercer standing under the awning of the hardware store with a paper cup in his hand. Dale watched the truck roll by, his expression unreadable, but he did not wave. Arthur saw him too and said nothing for nearly a mile. Then he looked out at the wet fields and murmured, "Some men fear what water can reveal more than what drought can hide." The words settled in the cab with the smell of coffee, old vinyl, and damp wool. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel. He had learned that wisdom often arrived quietly, and if a person spoke over it, it might not return. The trail to the north face was rougher after rain. Mud clung to the tires, grass brushed the undercarriage, and low clouds dragged shadows across the stone. They parked where the track ended near a stand of twisted juniper. From there they walked. Caleb carried the heavier canvas bag and the rope over one shoulder. Arthur carried the maps in a sealed tube and moved with a surveyor's patience, testing each step with his cane before trusting the ground. Ranger went ahead, pausing often, nose low, ears shifting to sounds no human ear could claim. The ridge rose before them, colder and larger than it had seemed the day before. Mist gathered along the stone face and slipped into cracks like breath returning to a body. Caleb found the red cloth he had tied near the opening. It hung there wet and bright against the gray rock, a small human mark on something ancient. Ranger reached the crack first and pressed his nose to the opening. He did not bark this time. He listened. The stillness around him deepened. Even Arthur seemed to hold his breath. Caleb set down the bag, pulled on his gloves, and knelt by the stone. The carved warning remained where he had uncovered it, the words darkened by rain, 35 feet in, "Do not stop." Arthur ran his fingers over the letters without touching them fully, as though greeting an old friend through glass. "Thomas carved that," he said softly. "I remember his hand. Always pressed too hard, like he was afraid the world would erase him." Caleb opened the canvas bag and took out the battery lantern. Its glow filled the crack with a steady white light. Inside, the passage waited, narrow at first, then widening after a few feet into a low corridor of worked stone. The air that came from it was cool and dry, carrying a mineral scent and something else beneath it, faint but clean. Caleb knew it before Arthur said anything. Water. Not open water, not a stream, but the hidden trace of it, the promise of it traveling through darkness. Ranger stepped forward, but Caleb held him gently by the harness. "Slow," he whispered. The dog obeyed, though every muscle in his body pointed inward. Arthur handed Caleb a piece of chalk. "Mark the wall every 5 feet. Old tunnels can make a straight line feel like a circle if fear gets involved." Caleb gave a small nod and ducked into the passage with Ranger close behind. Arthur followed last, slower but steady. The first few feet forced Caleb to bend at the shoulders. Stone brushed the back of his jacket. Dust lifted under his boots in soft gray puffs. The outside world faded quickly, losing its wind, its mist, its wide sky, until all that remained was lantern light, Ranger's careful breathing, Arthur's cane tapping behind them, and the quiet scrape of Caleb's chalk against stone. 5 feet. 10 feet. 15. The passage widened enough for Caleb to stand nearly upright. Timber braces appeared along the walls, old but sound, darkened by time and dry air. At 20 feet, Ranger stopped and raised one paw. Caleb froze with him. The dog turned his head toward the left wall, ears high, listening to something beyond the stone. A faint pulse answered from deep inside the ridge. Arthur closed his eyes. "I had forgotten that sound," he whispered. "Thomas called it the Sleeping River." Caleb marked 25 feet. Then 30. The air grew cooler. The mineral scent sharpened. Ranger moved again, now with solemn certainty, each step measured, as if he understood they were crossing from rumor into truth. At 35 feet, the lantern beam found the door. It stood lower than Caleb expected, set into the end of the passage, steel-framed and coated in dust, with no handle visible at first glance. Across its surface, beneath decades of stillness, were faded letters painted in white, "Briggs Water Survey, 1949. Below them, smaller and almost hidden near the bottom edge, was a pale handprint, not large, not adult. Caleb crouched and stared at it, feeling the hairs rise along his arms. Arthur's voice came from behind him, thin with memory. "Eleanor," he said. "She must have been here as a girl." Ranger sat before the door and bowed his head, not like a trained signal, but like a creature honoring what had waited there. Caleb lifted the brass tag from his pocket, the one stamped Major, and for reasons he could not explain, held it near the door. Somewhere inside the metal, a small click answered. The click was so small that Caleb might have missed it in the open air, but inside the ridge it moved through the passage like a whispered answer. Ranger lifted his head. Arthur Bell steadied one hand against the wall. For a breath, none of them moved. The brass tag stamped with Major's name rested in Caleb's palm, warm now from his skin, and the old steel door seemed to have recognized it the way a lonely house recognizes footsteps on the porch. Caleb looked for a latch and found a narrow circular plate half hidden beneath dust near the right edge. He brushed it clean with his glove, revealing a shallow slot shaped not for a key, but for something flat and oval. Arthur leaned closer, lantern light trembling across the deep lines of his face. "Thomas was clever," he murmured. "Too clever for men who thought money made them smart." Caleb slid Major's tag into the slot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then somewhere behind the door, a weight shifted with a soft metal sigh. The sound was not dramatic. It was tired, like a thing that had been holding its breath since 1949. Caleb pressed his shoulder gently against the door, careful and patient. It resisted, then gave way by an inch. Cold air slipped through the opening and touched his face. It smelled of stone, paper, old oil, and beneath all of it, clean water hidden in the dark. Ranger did not rush in. He stood beside Caleb, ears high, waiting for permission. That restraint moved Caleb more than fear ever could. He rested his hand on the dog's neck and whispered, "Easy, boy." Together they pushed the door wider. The lantern revealed a small chamber beyond, perhaps 12 feet across, built not like a mine shaft but like a careful little office carved into the ridge. Wooden shelves lined 2 walls. A metal desk stood in the center, its surface covered by a canvas cloth gray with dust. Glass jars sat in neat rows, each labeled with faded handwriting. Survey rods leaned in one corner. A hand pump, pipes, and old gauges occupied the far wall, their brass faces dulled but unbroken. On the back wall, painted in blue that had somehow survived the decades, was a map of Ridge Hollow with lines running beneath the town like veins under skin. Caleb stepped inside first, placing his boots only where the floor looked solid. Ranger followed, nose working slowly, not frantic, just solemn. Arthur entered last, and when he saw the painted wall map, his breath caught in a way that made Caleb turn. The old man took off his glasses, wiped them though they were not wet, and put them back on. "He was right," Arthur said. "All these years Thomas was right." Caleb lifted the canvas from the desk. Dust rose in a soft cloud, glittering in the lantern beam. Beneath it lay 3 leather-bound field journals, a sealed metal tube, a stack of typed letters, and a photograph in a cracked frame. The picture showed Eleanor as a girl, maybe 12 years old, standing beside Thomas and Major at the survey door. Her small palm, painted white, was pressed against the lower edge of the steel, leaving the handprint Caleb had seen outside. She was smiling, but her eyes looked serious, as if even then she understood that children sometimes inherit burdens before they have words for them. Caleb set the photograph down gently. Ranger moved to the far wall, where the hand pump rested beneath a row of gauges. He sniffed the base, then gave one quiet bark. Arthur limped over with surprising speed, reading the labels by lantern light. Test line. Pressure chamber. Sample draw. He touched one pipe and listened with his fingertips. Caleb watched him, struck by how the old man seemed younger in the presence of work that mattered. "Can it still function?" Caleb asked. Arthur did not answer right away. He opened one of the jars and held it beneath the pipe, then turned the pump handle with both hands. At first there was only a dry groan, the complaint of metal waking after too long a sleep. Arthur worked it again. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then a tremor moved through the pipe, faint but steady. Ranger's tail lifted. Caleb heard it before he saw it, a soft rush from somewhere behind the wall, like wind passing through leaves underground. A thin stream of water spilled from the spout into the glass jar, clear as morning light. No one spoke. The sound filled the chamber, gentle and impossible, and for a moment Caleb felt the ache of every dry creek bed he had driven past, every closed farm gate, every person in town who had learned to live with less because someone had hidden more. Arthur held the jar up to the lantern. His hand shook, but the water was steady. "Sweet mercy," he whispered. Caleb looked at the painted map again. The blue lines did not stop under Briggs Ridge. They ran beneath Ridge Hollow, under old farm lots, under the church, under the schoolhouse, under fields that had been written off as dying. This was not just water. It was memory, future proof, and grace held in the same clear jar. Then Caleb opened the metal tube from the desk. Inside were rolled documents sealed with brittle red tape. He unfurled the first one carefully. It was a formal survey report signed by Thomas Briggs, with measurements, depth notes, estimated flow, and a recommendation for community protection. The second document made Arthur's expression change. It was a letter from Red Veil Holdings, offering Thomas money for exclusive rights to the ridge, followed by another marked confidential. Caleb read only enough to understand. They had known. The company had known the water existed. They had wanted it quietly, before the town could claim it together. Arthur sank into the desk chair, his eyes wet but calm. "Thomas refused them," he said. "That is why he sealed it. Not to bury the truth forever. To keep it safe until someone could bring it back without selling it. Caleb thought of Eleanor's thin note, her steady faith, the way she had looked at Ranger as if seeing another dog from another lifetime. Ranger will know where to begin. Trust the dog, then trust the water. Caleb turned toward Ranger, who sat beside the flowing jar with his head slightly bowed. The chamber felt less like a hidden room now and more like a chapel made of stone, tools, and patience. Caleb had entered the ridge as a man given unwanted land. He stood inside it now as the keeper of something that could heal a town. Outside, beyond 35 feet of stone, the world was still wet with morning mist, still unaware. But in the heart of Briggs Ridge, water had begun to speak again. Caleb did not touch the water at first. He only watched it gather in the glass jar, clear and patient, as if it had been waiting beneath Briggs Ridge long enough to learn humility. Arthur Bells sat at the old metal desk with Thomas Briggs's survey report spread before him, his fingers resting near the signature but not covering it. Ranger remained beside the pipe, calm now, his duty changed from finding to guarding. The little chamber seemed to breathe around them. Dust floated in the lantern glow. The blue map on the wall shone softly wherever the light reached it, its underground lines running beneath Ridge Hollow with the quiet certainty of roots. Caleb read through the documents one by one, slowly, because every page felt like a person speaking after decades of being denied a voice. Thomas had measured flow rates, marked safe access points, estimated how many farms the aquifer could support, and written again and again that the water should be held in public trust. Eleanor had added notes later in the margins, her handwriting smaller, older, but just as firm. Do not sell the ridge. Protect the wells. Wait for the right witness. Caleb paused at that last word. Witness. Not owner. Not buyer. Not lucky man. Witness. It made the inheritance feel heavier, but cleaner somehow, like a tool placed in his hand instead of a prize dropped at his feet. Arthur opened another folder from the desk and found copies of letters sent to county officials long gone from office, letters that had never been answered. There were receipts for certified mail, sketches of proposed community wells, and a faded newspaper clipping about a summer drought that had nearly emptied the creek 40 years earlier. Beneath all of it was a plain white envelope addressed to Eleanor in Thomas's hand. Arthur looked at Caleb before opening it, and Caleb nodded, though he felt as if they were stepping into someone else's prayer. The letter was short. Thomas had written that if anything happened to him before the water could be protected, Eleanor should seal the survey room and trust Major to remember the place. He had written that men who wanted the ridge for profit would call it worthless in public and priceless in private. He had written that the water did not belong to him, but to the living and the unborn of Ridge Hollow. Arthur folded the letter with care. His eyes were wet, but his voice stayed steady. That sounds like him. Caleb looked at the flowing spout, then at Ranger. Then we bring it out. Arthur nodded, but there was caution in his face. Truth needs daylight, but it also needs witnesses. If you walk into town with only old papers and a jar of water, the wrong people will call it a misunderstanding by supper. Caleb understood. He had lived long enough to know that good news could be twisted if it arrived alone. So they photographed the chamber, the wall map, the water sample, the survey report, the letters, the painted date on the door, and the little white handprint left by Eleanor as a girl. Arthur used an old camera he had brought without mentioning it, snapping each image with a careful click that sounded almost ceremonial in the stone room. Caleb marked the passage measurements again on a clean sheet, noting the 35 feet from the entrance to the survey door. He took 2 jars of water, sealed them, and packed the original documents into the metal tube. Before leaving, he turned once more to the chamber. The water still ran in its thin clear stream, striking glass with a sound so gentle it nearly broke his heart. He shut the pump off carefully. Ranger watched him, then stepped to the door and looked back, waiting. Outside, the mist had burned away. Sunlight covered the ridge in pale gold, and the wet brush glittered as though the land itself had been washed clean. Arthur stood near the entrance, breathing hard but smiling faintly. Caleb helped him down the rocky trail without making him feel helped. Ranger moved ahead, stopping twice to look back at the crack in the stone. When they reached the truck, Caleb saw fresh tire tracks in the damp dirt near the turnaround, wider and newer than his own. Arthur saw them too. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Arthur bent slightly, studied the print, and exhaled through his nose. "Dale drives a new heavy-duty pickup," he said. Caleb looked toward the empty road. The ridge, which had felt sacred minutes before, now felt watched. Still, he did not feel fear. He felt the old quiet part of himself settle into place, the part that knew how to keep a steady hand when the day turned uncertain. They drove straight to the courthouse. Marcy Bell looked up from her desk when they entered, and whatever she saw in their faces made her close the ledger in front of her without asking a question. Caleb placed the metal tube, the sealed jars, and Arthur's photographs on the counter. Ranger sat beside him, ears forward, as if attending a meeting older than the room itself. Arthur spoke first. He told Marcy to call the county recorder, the water board, the sheriff's civil office, and Pastor Glenn from the White Church on Maple Street, not because this was a church matter, but because the town trusted him to stand in a room without lying. Marcy's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the first photograph, the one showing the blue map painted on the chamber wall. "So it was true," she whispered. Caleb looked through the window toward Main Street, where ordinary life continued for a few more innocent minutes. A woman crossed with groceries. A boy rode a bicycle through a puddle. The diner sign flickered in daylight. Then he saw Dale Mercer standing across the street, phone pressed to his ear, his face turned toward the courthouse. Dale lowered the phone when their eyes met. He did not smile this time. Caleb rested his hand on Ranger's head and felt the dog lean into him, steady as stone, warm as home. Eleanor had waited years for the right witness, and Caleb finally understood why. The hardest part was not finding the hidden water. The hardest part was keeping it from becoming hidden again. By noon, the courthouse conference room had become the quietest place in Ridge Hollow. People entered with the uncertain steps of those who had been called to witness something larger than gossip, larger than land, larger than the dry habits of a town that had learned not to expect rescue. Marcy Bell stood near the long oak table with the county recorder at her side, arranging photographs in careful order. Arthur Bell sat with both hands folded over the head of his cane, his face pale from the morning's climb but lit by a steadiness Caleb had not seen in him before. Pastor Glenn arrived in a denim jacket with rain spots still dark on the shoulders, carrying no Bible, only a yellow legal pad and the patient expression of a man used to listening before speaking. 2 members of the county water board came next, followed by Sheriff Ellis, who was not there for trouble but for record, procedure, and the calming weight of an official witness. Caleb stood near the window with Ranger seated at his left boot. The German shepherd did not pace. He did not whine. He simply watched the room the way he had watched the ridge, as if he understood that some doors were made of steel and others were made of doubt. On the table lay the sealed water jars, the metal tube, Thomas Briggs's survey report, Eleanor's notes, Arthur's photographs, and the old brass tag stamped with Major's name. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and struck the jars until the water inside threw faint trembling lines across the wood. No one touched them for a long moment. Then Marcy began. Her voice was soft at first, but it strengthened as she read the chain of ownership, the recorded transfer from Eleanor Briggs to Caleb Whitaker, the survey references, and the forgotten filings that had once sat in county storage before pieces of the story vanished into time. Arthur followed with his account, speaking slowly, leaving out nothing that mattered and adding nothing to make himself important. He told them about Thomas Briggs, the summer surveys, the company men in polished cars, the sealed chamber, and Eleanor's long instruction that if a man came with a German shepherd and the ridge in his name, the preserved maps were to be released. Some people exchanged glances at that, but no one laughed. Not after seeing the photographs. Not after the water board members leaned over the blue wall map and went silent in the way experts go silent when old facts begin fitting together too well. Caleb spoke last. He did not dress his words in drama. He described finding the crack, the carved warning, the 35 feet of passage, the steel survey door, the handprint, the pump, and the water. He said Ranger had led him there. He said Eleanor had known the dog would know where to begin. When he finished, the room held a stillness deeper than doubt. Then one of the water board members, a woman named Helen Price with gray hair tucked beneath a canvas-field cap, opened the first jar and tested a strip from her kit. She watched the color change, then looked at the second board member. "This is preliminary," she said, choosing each word carefully. "But this is clean groundwater. Very clean. We need full lab work and a certified survey, but if these maps are even close to accurate, Ridge Hollow has been sitting above a major aquifer system." Pastor Glenn lowered his head, not in display, but in gratitude that seemed to pass quietly through him. Marcy covered her mouth with one hand. Arthur stared at the jar as if listening to Thomas speak through it. Caleb looked toward the window and saw a small crowd had gathered outside on the courthouse steps. Word had moved through town, as it always did, but this time it carried wonder instead of mockery. June from the diner stood near the front, arms folded against the wind. Behind her were farmers, store owners, the mail carrier, 2 teenagers with bicycles, and old Mrs. Lang from the Dry Creek Road, whose well had failed the previous August. Across the street, Dale Mercer stood apart from the others beside his heavy-duty pickup. A dark sedan was parked behind him, unfamiliar, glossy, and too clean for the muddy curb. Caleb watched as a man in a tailored coat stepped from the sedan and spoke into Dale's ear. Dale's face tightened. The man looked up at the courthouse windows, and for 1 second his eyes found Caleb's through the glass. There was no open hostility in his expression. Only calculation. That troubled Caleb more. Sheriff Ellis noticed Caleb's gaze and turned. His jaw moved slightly as he took in the sedan. "Red Veil?" Arthur asked without looking. Sheriff Ellis nodded once. "That name is on the registration, or something close enough to it." The room changed then. The discovery had been beautiful inside the Ridge, almost holy in its quietness, but now it had reached the world of signatures, claims, money, and men who knew how to make a blessing sound like a business opportunity. Helen Price capped the jar and placed it back on the table with both hands. "Until the county verifies this, no one touches that access point," she said. "No private testing, no equipment, no drilling." Caleb felt Ranger lean against his leg. The dog's warmth steadied him. Then the tailored man entered the courthouse with Dale behind him. Marcy stepped into the doorway before they reached the conference room. Her voice was polite, but it had iron under it. "This is a recorded county review. You may wait outside." The man smiled as if smiles were tools. "We only want to speak with Mr. Whitaker. We represent a party prepared to make him a generous offer for land that may be difficult for a private citizen to manage." Every eye turned to Caleb. A few days earlier, words like generous offer might have sounded like shelter, a repaired truck, a rented room, a chance to stop drifting. He thought of cold nights, gas station coffee, rangers sleeping across the seat to keep warm. Then he thought of Eleanor's handwriting, Thomas's blue lines, Arthur's shaking hand around the jar, and the small town outside that had been drying up while truth waited in stone. Caleb stepped forward, not loudly, not proudly, only clearly. "The Ridge is not for sale." The man's smile thinned. Dale looked at the floor. Caleb rested one hand on Ranger's head. "And the water is not mine to sell." For the first time all day, Arthur Bell smiled fully. Outside, the courthouse bell rang once in the wind, and the sound moved through Ridge Hollow like the beginning of rain. The words did not echo loudly in the courthouse, but they stayed in the room long after Caleb spoke them. "The Ridge is not for sale. The water is not mine to sell." For a moment, even the tailored man from Redvale seemed unsure what to do with a sentence that had no price hidden inside it. He adjusted his cuffs, glanced once at the jars on the table, then gave Caleb a small professional nod, the kind men give when they are not finished but must pretend they are. Dale Mercer followed him out without meeting anyone's eyes. The door closed softly behind them, and in that softness, something in Ridge Hollow changed. Not all at once. Not like thunder. More like the first crack in winter ice, quiet but certain, telling the river beneath that it would move again. The following weeks came with paperwork, survey crews, water tests, county meetings, and more questions than Caleb had answered in years. Specialists from Cheyenne arrived with equipment and careful language. They tested the samples, mapped the underground flow, examined Thomas Briggs's notes, and confirmed what the old surveyor had known before half the town was born. Beneath Briggs Ridge ran a clean aquifer large enough to support community wells, restore dry farms, and give Ridge Hollow a future that had nearly slipped away unnoticed. Red Veil's lawyers sent letters. Caleb did not answer them alone. Marcy Bell recorded every document. Helen Price filed emergency protection requests. Sheriff Ellis made sure no one touched the north face without authorization. Pastor Glenn opened the church hall for public meetings, and Arthur Bell, frail but fierce in his brown cardigan, sat in the front row of each one with Thomas's map laid across his knees like a sacred text. Caleb attended every meeting with Ranger at his side. He still wore the same worn olive jacket, the same gray shirt, the same dark jeans, the same rugged boots dusted white from Ridgestone. He did not suddenly become polished because people had started listening. That was part of why they trusted him. He spoke simply. He asked that the land be placed under a community trust in Eleanor Briggs's name. He asked that the first protected well serve the families whose wells had failed. He asked that a portion of the ridge be set aside for a small veterans' shelter, nothing grand, just cabins, heat, clean beds, tools, and work for men and women who knew what it meant to come home and still feel outside the door. Some folks cried when he said that. Caleb did not look away from them, but he did not make a show of comfort either. He had learned that dignity was sometimes the kindest blanket a person could offer. By early fall, the first well house stood at the foot of Briggs Ridge, painted white with a blue roof, simple and sturdy against the Wyoming wind. On its front beam, a carved sign read Eleanor Briggs Community Water Trust. Beneath that, smaller letters read, "Found by faith, guarded by kindness." Arthur said the wording was too sentimental, but he stood under it for nearly 10 minutes the day it was installed, wiping his glasses more than once. June brought coffee from the diner. Marcy brought copies of the trust papers. Helen brought the first certified water report in a folder tied with blue ribbon. And Caleb brought Ranger, who walked straight to the well house door, sniffed the threshold, and sat down as if approving the work. When the pump was opened for the first time, water flowed into a steel basin with a clear, ringing sound. Children laughed. Farmers removed their hats. Mrs. Lang from Dry Creek Road filled a glass jar and held it to her chest without drinking, as if she needed to feel the weight of hope before tasting it. Caleb stood near the back of the crowd, one hand on Ranger's shoulder, feeling sunlight warm the sleeve of his old jacket. He thought of Eleanor as a girl leaving her white handprint on the survey door. He thought of Thomas carving words into stone with the stubborn belief that someone would one day keep walking. He thought of Major, the first shepherd, and Ranger, who had heard the same hidden truth through 75 years of silence. Winter came gently that year. Not easy, but gentler. The creek did not return overnight, and farms did not heal in a season, but people began making plans again. That was the real miracle, Caleb decided. Not water alone, but the return of tomorrow to voices that had stopped speaking of it. The veterans' shelter began as 3 cabins near the Lower Ridge Road, built by volunteers on Saturdays. Caleb worked beside them, measuring lumber, setting posts, repairing an old stove, showing younger men how to square a frame and older men how to accept a hot meal without apology. He took the smallest cabin for himself and Ranger, though everyone told him he had earned better. It had a bed, a table, a hook for his jacket, a rug where Ranger slept, and a window facing the ridge. To Caleb, it felt enormous. On the first night he slept there, snow began to fall after midnight. The flakes moved past the window in slow white silence. Ranger lifted his head from the rug, ears angled toward the dark shape of Briggs Ridge. Caleb woke and listened too. For a moment he thought he heard it again, that faint pulse beneath stone, the sleeping river moving in the earth. He rose, crossed the small room, and opened the door. Cold air entered, clean and sharp. Across the yard, the well-house lantern burned steadily, Beyond it, the ridge rested under moonlight, no longer unwanted, no longer voiceless. Caleb stood there in his worn olive jacket, gray shirt, dark jeans, and rugged boots, his breath turning pale in the air, Ranger pressed warmly against his leg. He had once believed home was something the world gave to other men. Now he understood that sometimes home was not found in a deed, a cabin, or even a miracle under stone. Sometimes home began the moment a person chose to protect what could have been sold. The wind moved softly over the ridge, and somewhere deep below, water continued its patient journey through the dark, carrying with it the kindness of a widow, the faith of a forgotten surveyor, the loyalty of 2 German shepherds, and the quiet life of a man who had arrived with nothing, then stayed long enough to become a blessing.